Thank you very much. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Reclaim Rent Control for an opportunity to talk about the issues around rent control, about tenants, and what's happening in our city today. And so my name is Jack Evans, and I'm running for re-election to the Ward 2 Council position on the Council of the District of Columbia. I've served on the council since 1991 for the last 29 years representing Ward 2. And have had a very, very positive experience as we've seen our city go from a city that was struggling terribly back in the early 1990s to what I would say is the most dynamic city in America today. And we worked very hard to make Washington that city, and I will continue to do that as a council member. Ward 2, in many ways, is the breadbasket of Washington, D.C. It produces over 50% of the revenues, and is a very, very diverse ward, made up of homeowners, tenants, 2 large universities, and on, 127 religious institutions, a real diverse and amalgamation of Washington, D.C. So it's been a very honor and privilege of mine to represent this ward during that time period. My certainly strength is in the finances. I chaired the Finance and Revenue Committee the last 20 years. And in these times of severe financial difficulties, I believe that my expertise in finance will be critical and helpful to our city.
Great, thank you. So we'll go ahead and start with the first question, which is approximately 90,000 families live in apartments that are under DC's rent control program, which is currently up for reauthorization. The council's temporary universal ban on all rent increases exposes the need for increased tenant protections. What changes, if any, would you make to DC's rent control laws?
Well, the rent control law, and I'll give you a little bit of history on it. I've been the champion of the rent control law, literally going back 30 years. And I think it's important for me to mention Jim McGrath, who passed away recently, who was really my mentor on this. When I chaired the Advisory Neighborhood Commission at DuPont Circle in the 1980s, Jim and I worked very closely on the Brookings Project and on a number of issues to strengthen the DuPont Circle neighborhood. And most recently, I brought along, Jim wrote in the In-Towner before he passed away, a full-page article about myself and the issues that we worked on together, whether it be Scholl's Cafeteria or Brookings or saving the Penn Women's Club down on 17th Street, a number of issues, and Jim was very supportive of my candidacy. And in rent control, what I've done over the years, working pretty closely with the chairman, Phil Mendelson, is to make sure rent control got reauthorized. And certainly, we used to do it on a 5-year basis. And then 10 years ago, Phil and I made sure that it got done on a 10-year basis and was a very strong rent control law for tenants. Keep in mind, when we do authorize the rent control law, it goes up to Congress, and that's always a fear we have that somehow Congress will intervene and interfere with our rent control law, particularly in today's world where you have a Republican president and a Republican Senate that may not look too favorably on what we're doing. So I know we have worked closely with our Congresswoman to make sure we craft a law that can get through and make sure we keep rent control very strong here in the district. Certainly some of the issues I've looked at are the 12% rate, whether or not that return on investment should be what it is today or should it be scaled back, the 2% inflation rate. The other issue is the capital improvements. I know we always 10 years ago debated whether the capital improvement, the way it was structured, is fair to the tenants, fair to the landlords, and how to make all of that work. So I would take a look at all of those issues as we move forward when I'm back on the council and see if we can strengthen the rent control law. And certainly sitting down with TENAC and the other groups who are involved in rent control and see what ideas we can come up with.
Great, thank you. The City Council has enacted legislation that prohibits rent increases during the state of emergency and prohibits evictions until 30 days after the public health crisis has ended. We know that nationally, 1/3 of tenants could not pay their rent on April 1st, and given that over 87,000 DC workers have filed for unemployment in the last month, the statistic may be higher in the district. While the courts in DC are closed to the public, until recently, landlords were continuing to file eviction cases online in order to push through evictions as soon as possible. As the crisis continues, tenants will fall farther behind on their rent and accrue more debt. What would you do to address this issue if you were on the council now?
Essentially, what I would do is work with all the interested parties. Again, the tenants, particularly the landlords, the banks, everyone, to figure out a way for tenants when this crisis ends to have payment plans. No one is going to be able to come up with a lump sum of what they owe. It's just impossible. If someone's out of work, they're not earning any money at all, and they can't pay the rent now, certainly that's not going to change when this epidemic ends. And so what I would absolutely put in place, get my colleagues to go along with and vote for, are payment plans that will enable tenants over a period of time to be able to make up the rent they owe. But we'll also have to work with the landlords because, of course, the tenants pay the landlords, and then the landlords have to pay somebody, whether it's mortgages they have to the banks or whether it's utility bills or whatever payments they're going to have to make. So this may be the opportunity where the city has to step in. Now, one of the problems, of course, the city now has is an $800 million shortfall this year alone, which will probably grow to over $1 billion next year and beyond. So the city is probably not in a place, and even though we are better financially off than any city in America, not in a place where we're going to be able to substitute our money for the money that the tenants would have paid to the landlords. So this is where my financial expertise is going to come in to help restructure with the banks, working with the banks, the landlords, the tenants, and everyone to come up with an equitable way to make sure everybody survives this thing. The tenants stay in their places that they're renting, the landlords don't go bankrupt so they lose the buildings, and the banks manage to somehow stay afloat. This is not going to be an easy time, and there are no easy solutions for this, but that's where my expertise comes in.
Great, thank you. The DC Housing Authority states that the 6,600 plus units of public housing need up to $2.5 billion in deferred maintenance and capital improvements. The agency has charted a 20-year redevelopment plan. What would you like to see happen in public housing, and what would you do?
You know, I've already been working on this, and it's interesting. And with the chief financial officer, again, as I mentioned, I had jurisdiction over the Finance and Revenue Committee the last 20 years, and Jeff DeWitt, the CFO, and so he was under my committee. So I also worked carefully, and this is an analogous situation that I would do for public housing. And Jeff and I have already begun putting this plan together. At Metro, we had a deferred maintenance plan of billions of dollars. And as you know, I chaired the board for the last 3.5 years and was successful. And I will say this, and it sounds self-serving, but I'm going to say it anyway. Without me, we would never have gotten dedicated funding for Metro. You needed someone who was going to push, who was going to embarrass the two governors, who was going to embarrass Congress into taking action that brought about the dedicated funding that people said would never have happened. That's exactly what we have to do for public housing. With the $3 billion, you have 2.5 with $3 billion deficit in repair work. We need a dedicated funding source and a dedicated fixing plan, exactly like we did for Metro, in order to rehabilitate those units and bring them all to a place where people are proud to live there and not embarrassed. That's the plan. And it's already in place in the CFO's office. So we're not talking about what I would do, could do, might do, thinking about. It's a plan that's already in place.
Great, thanks. From encampment clearings to the threat of COVID outbreaks in shelters, we know that DC's homeless services programs are not working for many residents. How would you ensure that all DC residents have safe, quality, and affordable housing?
Well, I wouldn't characterize this as it's not working. I would characterize it differently. Representing Ward 2, you represent the largest amount of homeless individuals in the region, literally. And why is that? Well, because Ward 2 is the downtown ward. People come to Ward 2 because it's safe. And if you're going to panhandle or whatever you're going to do, Ward 2 is where you would want to do those activities. So it's an attractive place. And so I've dealt with homelessness over the 30 years that I've been on the council. And homelessness is not a monolithic issue. People are homeless for lots of different reasons. You certainly have people who are down on their luck, who for some reason or another didn't have money, were evicted or out on the street and are struggling. But you also have a larger group of people who are struggling in other ways, whether they have substance abuse problems, or they have alcoholism, mental illness. There's a whole array of reasons why people find themselves on the streets of Washington, D.C., and on the streets and sidewalks of Ward 2. And so you have to take a comprehensive approach. Not one approach fits every situation. If someone's down on their luck, then we can help those individuals find affordable housing, which we need more of, and find a way path back into the marketplace, so to speak, whether it's job training, identifying jobs. And I would say some of the areas where the district has failed is Department of Employment Services right out of the box. They do a terrible job of trying to identify jobs for many people in our city who need them. The oversight has been poor and the operation has been poor, and that needs to change. Then you need the wraparound services. Again, for people who have substance abuse problems, alcoholism, mental illness, giving someone a bottle of pills and say, take them and good luck is not the answer. You have to have individual care for people on a constant basis. The New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, the New York Avenue Shelter, it's not really a shelter, it's a homeless clinic, is a great example, something that I championed and got opened in Ward 2, where individuals can come, where they can shower, where they can get training, where they can get help, both physical and mental help. And those are the kind of wraparound services we need. And then places like the N Street Village, again, which is in Ward 2, a women's shelter where people can come, where they can get off of the street, where they can get the physical, mental help that they may need, and then to be able to transition into affordable housing and other areas and become, for lack of a better way of describing it, productive members of society. But that's the goal. But it's not a single, you build more affordable housing and that solves the homeless problem. That is a failed approach.
Thank you. So this is just the 1 minute quick question. We've talked about DC's affordable housing crisis with respect to rent control, public housing, and homelessness now. What would be your top 3 priorities related to housing as a council member? And you can just list them.
Okay. Well, I think the 3 would be certainly affordable housing. Again, we've talked about that. We need to have more affordable housing. Housing Production Trust Fund, something I helped start, is a method that produces affordable housing. Secondly, we talked about this already, fixing up public housing. We have an array of public housing in the city. We talked about it having a $2.5 to $3 billion shortfall in maintenance, and I've already outlined for you a plan that is actually in place to correct that. And then finally, transitional housing. And again, we've talked a little bit about that. Someone who comes off of the street, but is not ready to move into their own unit. What's that transitional housing that gives people the life skills in order to then manage their life as they move into another chapter. And again, when we built the convention center, there was a group that really worked on that. Ibrahim Mookman, his wife Carol, did a lot of that kind of life skills training to help people, transition.
Thanks. So the impacts of coronavirus have also revealed a lack of a real safety net for workers in DC, particularly undocumented workers and those working in the informal and gig economies. How would you address these issues?
Well, again, using some of the same tactics we've talked about here. For people who are undocumented, for people who are in areas, in the gray areas of society, the District of Columbia, the city itself, has to provide those kind of services to help those individuals. And what happened in the situation we're in now, Events DC stepped forward with $5 million of the $15 million that they had in their reserve fund to put in place programs to help and support people who are undocumented or in some sort of transition to make sure that they don't fall through the cracks. And again, that one is a very straightforward solution. The city itself is going to have to take the actions that are necessary in order to help those that will not get taken care of by the federal and state programs that are in existence now.
And the last question, the coronavirus pandemic has brought to the forefront issues of systemic inequalities in DC. We know that about 79% of the COVID-19 related deaths in DC were Black residents, who only make up about 46% of the population. What do you see as some of the underlying factors contributing to these disparities, and what would you do to tackle them?
Well, there's really two parts to that question. So we can talk about the healthcare part and then a larger issue of inequality. On the healthcare side, it's because in wards 7 and 8, we do not have a healthcare system that is anywhere close to the ones that we have in the rest of the city or the rest of the region. And that, I assume, is contributing to some of the problems that we're having. What I've advocated since I've been here and have worked closely with Councilmember Gray and others to try and get done is to get a brand new hospital built in Ward 7 and 8. It has been proposed now to get one built on the St. Elizabeth campus by the mayor, and hopefully this time it will happen. In the past, I have worked very hard to maintain the United Medical Center, to make sure it provided quality care, but it has really failed miserably, and a brand new hospital. But a hospital alone is not enough. You need the clinic system in order to support the hospital. Let me give you an example. Last 4th of July, I got a major splinter under my fingernail. What do? Where do you go? Do you run to the emergency room at a hospital? Or do you go to DuPont Circle to the Urgy Center or whatever they call it and go in there, and there happens to be a nurse and she's great at removing splinters. You know, I use that as just an example. You need clinics in the neighborhoods for people who just have routine problems that don't go to emergency rooms to do. And then also to provide your basic primary care. Again, a lot of the reasons that people become ill is they don't have primary care physicians to go to on a regular basis. We have to almost start to change the mindset in many of our communities that it's important to go see a doctor on a fairly regular basis, even when you're well, to make sure that you don't get sick. And the same with OBGYN, the same with a lot of those kind of issues, where if a woman is pregnant, she should go to the doctors 9 times before she has the baby, not the first time in the emergency room when she's delivering the baby. You know, those kind of things are critical. And so when you have an epidemic like this, you don't have a population that's predisposed to become sick. The bigger issue in income and just inequality stems from a lot of areas where the city has tried but has not been successful. You start with education, and the education goes all the way back to when a child is born. I'm a father of triplets. I have 3 children, and my wife passed away when they were 6. So in many ways, I was a mom-dad. And the most important thing to me was to making sure my children got an education from the day they were born. I remember going to the church up the street, Mount Zion, when the kids were 2 years old, and being in a school in a basement and singing the songs like "The Wheels on the Bus Go Bound, Bound, Bound," all of those kind of things. And so by the time children get to 1st grade, they have an education, they have a vocabulary, and these are the things that in many ways are lacking in parts of our city. Early childhood, 0 to 3, early childhood, schools that really work where children learn, and that is the basis. And then good jobs when they get out of school. That's the conundrum. Once you've solved that problem, you begin to solve most of your society's problems.
Hi, I'm Jordan Grossman. I'm running to represent Ward 2 on the DC Council and the June 2nd Democratic primary and the June 16th special election. I'm a 5th-generation DC resident, and I've spent my life in public service, working for President Obama, DC's Medicaid agency, on Capitol Hill, and for a DC federal judge. I know that working in government is a privilege. It's not a business opportunity. Yet for too long, we here in Ward 2 have had to compete for the attention of our council member, Jack Evans, with literal paying clients who could afford his price. I think after nearly 30 years of Jack, enough is enough, and it's time for a change. You know, we need a clean break from Jack Evans and his corrupt political machine, not only because of that shameless corruption, although it should be enough. We need that clean break because we need someone who's going to actually prioritize the values and the priorities that matter. Affording a place to live, high quality childcare, getting around on, if you're biking or walking, and easing the burden of student loan debt. Together, we can build a more equitable and inclusive DC for all of us. Thank you.
Approximately 90,000 families live in apartments that are under DC's rent control program, which is currently up for reauthorization. The DC Council's temporary universal ban on all rent increases exposes the need for increased tenant protections. What changes, if any, would you make to DC's rent control laws?
So think we need big changes to DC's rent control laws. I actually was proud to stand with the Reclaim Rent Control Coalition at the rally in Columbia Heights a few weeks ago when Councilmember Nadeau pledged to introduce the platform as a bill in the DC Council. I think this is, when it comes to affordable housing in the district, as you know, this crisis has made clear, we need stronger tenant protections. We need stronger rent control. That means, you know, number one, we should not have vacancy increases. That's basically giving landlords an incentive to push people out of their homes. If anything, we should give them an incentive to keep people in their homes. The second thing is we need more affordable housing. We need to protect the affordable housing stock that there exists. But right now, our rent control laws are stuck pegged to a date that was decades in the past. We need a date that's dynamic and that changes as we go along. So that's the way we keep our affordable housing stock in rent control and it doesn't fall away. The other thing we need to do is close loopholes. Right now, so many landlords can do things like hardship petitions. And what that means is they can get their petition to get out of their obligations under rent control. So already we don't have enough rent control units, we don't have enough affordable units, and landlords are getting out of the obligations they have. I think we need to crack down on that, especially because the standards are not enforced in a strong way. So I think we need to do that. More broadly, we have tenant protections on the books in DC. Some of them are the strongest in the country, but they are not making enough of a difference in people's day-to-day lives. Look, in DC, it's actually illegal for a landlord to discriminate against someone because they're going to use a voucher for part of their rent. And yet we see over and over again, whether it's in Ward 2 or across the city, where landlords are actually doing that. They're advertising in writing that they're not going to take vouchers. That's wrong and illegal. We need to step up our enforcement against these kinds of discriminatory practices that push people out of their homes. If we're going to have tenant protections, if we're going to strengthen our rent control laws, it's not enough for them just to be on the books and on paper. They need to make a real difference in people's lives. You know, I've worked in government my whole career. One of the things that I've focused on is oversight and accountability. We need to make sure that these protections, our housing protections, are making a real difference. It's not enough just to be on paper. I think beyond that, we need to make sure that when we look at rent control, we're not just reauthorizing it, that we're expanding it and we're closing the loopholes. So often what happens is we see something that sounds great, but there's a loophole or people can get around it. We need to stop that. Enough is enough. We're seeing right now during the COVID-19 crisis just how important it is for everyone to be able to live in a safe place they can afford. So let's take action to strengthen rent control, close the loopholes, and make DC more affordable for everyone.
Okay, thank you. So next question. The City Council has enacted legislation that prohibits rent increases during the state of emergency and prohibits evictions until 30 days after the public health crisis has ended. We know that nationally, 1/3 of tenants could not pay their rent on April 1st. And given that over 72,000 DC workers have filed for unemployment in the last month, that number may be higher in the district. While the courts in DC are closed to the public, landlords continue to file eviction cases online so that they can push evictions through as soon as possible. As the crisis continues, tenants will continue to fall behind on their rent and accrue debt. What would you do to address this if you were on the council now?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's so important because right now what we have is a very temporary, immediate sort of short-term fix, right? You can't get evicted right now, but things just keep adding up on the back end, add up. I think that's wrong, and I think we need to take action on it. One way we can do that is to shift the burden onto landlords and property managers and property owners. So we could say, look, we as the government are going to make sure that we're going to take action, but we're going to take this burden off the renters themselves. They are the most vulnerable. So they should not be the ones who are bearing this burden of uncertainty over time. So we could take action and say, look, you are not only are you not going to get evicted, but you're not going to be responsible for this rent that you can't afford to pay, which by the way, affects people up and down DC, up and down Ward 2. It's just such a widespread issue. And so I think we need to take the burden away from the renters and put it towards somewhere else, to whether it's the landlords, the property managers, or on and on. I think too often, even when folks are acting in a good faith way, we are saying like, well, the benefits are going to trickle down to renters or ordinary folks, or you got to jump through, renters will give you some help. You're going to have to jump through all these hoops and meet all these qualifications and all of this stuff. I think we're seeing that with some of the assistance that's been made available after the COVID-19 crisis or during the COVID-19 crisis. Some of the programs are very well intentioned, but it's very hard to get a hold of the folks to help you, whether you're applying for unemployment or something like that. Those systems aren't there, but the burden is on you, right? It's on individuals. I think one thing our government should be doing is trying to take more systematic approaches. And I think rent is such an important issue and example of that. In DC, we already, before this crisis, had huge pressures on renter households. I think something like a third of our renter households couldn't afford to pay rent without paying more than a third of their income. It's 30,000 people who couldn't afford basically, to live in this city. So we needed to take action before COVID, and now the situation is just more acute. So I think, look, we should take clear action, make it easily understandable, and shift the burden away from the renters and onto the other folks further up the chain of rent payments, so that who can handle it more, and then put the onus on them to say if they want to get paid back, they've got to take the action. They're the ones who have to jump through the hoops. Let's not make individual people who are struggling with childcare and maybe losing a job, maybe a sickness, maybe working as an essential worker. Let's not put the pressure on them. Let's put the pressure somewhere else. So I think we can take clear and decisive, easily understandable action to help renters and make sure that they're not being subject to these just deferred processes, that they're not being exploited at all.
Okay, thank you. Next question. The DC Housing Authority states that 6,600 or more units of public housing need up to $2.5 billion in deferred maintenance and capital improvements. And the agency has charted a 20-year redevelopment plan. What would you like to see happen in public housing, and what would you do?
So I think the current state of our public housing in DC is just shameful. It's immoral. I think it is also the biggest environmental justice issue that we have. We have children and elderly and other vulnerable folks in our public housing who are getting sick from government provided housing. I think the City paper did a great story on this a little while ago, where we're literally just having people go over and over again to the emergency room because of the hazards, whether it's lead or mold or not, their pipes don't work. So I think, this is, when it comes to government, this is just like a sort of fundamental issue. If we're providing housing to folks, it's got to be safe and healthy. And so I think we need to make this a priority. I think there's been a lot of groups like Bread for the City and the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless who put out great recommendations on what we should do on the 20-year plan and things like that. I think number one, we want to make sure to keep as much public housing public as we can. I think there's been a long history of some of these types of neighborhoods getting redeveloped, and there's been a lot of promises that you can come back and all of this stuff, and the promises have not been kept. And so there's a lot of communities there that are really vulnerable and who have seen promises broken in the past. I think we need to do better. One way we can do better is by doing something either called Build First, which is make sure that when we're redeveloping or fixing some of these problems, that we're building as much around people who are already living there as possible, so they are only displaced from where they are for as short a period of time as possible. So if you can build on the parking lot next door and let people stay in their homes for as long as possible, and then they can move in to the building that was in the parking lot and shift over by, that's just one basic way, so that we've seen in DC, some of these projects, they get bogged down for 5-10 years and people are displaced for all that time. So we need to do much better on that. Number two, I think we need to make sure that preventing displacement itself is one of our top explicit priorities when it comes to how we deal with public housing. Often when we do these sort of redevelopment projects, not only, even in the best case scenarios, sometimes we're moving from units that are the size of for a family, and then we're moving to 1 bedroom and studio type units. And that just isn't going to be workable for a lot of families who have been in these facilities. So we need to make sure that we're prioritizing preventing displacement. I actually think we should write that into the comprehensive plan. That's something the DC Council works on and they're working on now. And it basically charts the path for the next, years and decades for how our city is going to develop. Right now, it doesn't have an explicit top priority. It has a bunch of different things. I think affordable housing, prevention displacement, and giving people the right of return to their housing should be our number one priority when we're talking about public housing and the plan for the future.
Thank you. Okay, next question. So from encampment clearings to the threat of COVID outbreaks in shelters, we know DC's homeless service programs are not working for many residents. How would you ensure that all DC residents have safe, quality, and affordable housing?
Yeah, I think the COVID-19 crisis has made it clearer than ever how important it is that every DC resident has access to a safe place that they can afford to live. We're under a stay-at-home order, but what happens when you don't have a home? I think we need to make sure that we're putting these people's needs, our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness, we need to make sure their needs are addressed in a realistic way. I think that starts with treating them as our neighbors, not as a nuisance, right? These are folks in Ward 2, we have the highest percentage of DC residents experiencing homeless of any ward. And that's because we're the downtown ward, that's where a lot of people come. And we need to make sure that these residents of ours are getting taken care of in the way that makes sense. So I think there's a few things we can do. Number one, let's do more when it comes to housing first, which means let's get folks into permanent housing that they can stay in that is safe and healthy. Let's provide them with the folks that need it with supportive services and wraparound services. So if they are dealing with an issue that they can, have access to those services once they're in housing. Let's not put off getting them in housing. But I will have to say, there's a lot of folks who are experiencing homelessness just because it's so expensive to live here. They don't, they may not need services. They just need a place to live that they can afford. So we also need to do things like temporary affordable housing where you're just like, look, let's get folks into housing and that they can afford. The second thing is I think we need to invest in things that really do work. Like we have drop-in centers and street outreach workers. In Ward 2, we have a drop-in center right down at like 14th and New York Avenue. And it's like a one-stop shop for our neighbors experiencing homelessness. They can take a shower, wash their clothes, be connected to services. Those things really work, and I think we need to invest in them. Similarly, we need to invest in street outreach teams. Some of them have been really effective. They're not that expensive. And one thing I really like about street outreach teams is it helps prevent the criminalization of homelessness. So if you live in your neighborhood and there's a street outreach worker who handles these issues, instead of people necessarily calling the police, they call the outreach worker who knows like, hey, yeah, that's Steve. I know Steve. He's around our neighborhood a lot. This is the thing he needs, right? And so instead of Steve going and interacting with the law enforcement, he's getting the services that he needs. I think another thing that one of the best ways we can address homelessness is preventing people from experiencing homelessness in the first place. So there's things like the Emergency Rental Assistance Program and family reunification. And what that is let's give people, like, if you can't make rent this month because you had a health issue, right? Let's give them the little bit of money that it requires so that they don't get evicted. And that's going to prevent all sorts of issues on the overall, and it's better and healthier for everyone. And the last thing I will just say is the best solution for homelessness is the best solution for all of us, which is more affordable housing.
Okay, thank you. This next question is just a minute. So we've talked about DC's affordable housing crisis with respect to rent control, public housing, and homelessness. But could you list your top 3 housing-related priorities? And just a list would be good.
Yeah, I mean, I think the top priorities are preservation and production of more affordable housing, prioritizing equity in our housing efforts, including through implementation of fair housing laws and passing the Racial Equity Achieves Results Act, which would make us, DC, consider racial equity considerations in everything we do, especially budget considerations, and enforcing strengthening and enforcing protections that we put on the books so that they're not just on paper, but they make a real difference in people's day-to-day lives when it comes to the housing they live in.
Okay, thank you. And the next two questions are 3 minutes. So that was the only 1 minute question. The impacts of coronavirus have also revealed the lack of a real safety net for workers in DC, particularly undocumented workers and those working in the informal and the gig economy. How would you address those issues?
Yeah, I think number one, we cannot exclude workers who are the backbones of our communities and our economy. In DC, we have tons of undocumented neighbors who make our communities run. And it doesn't make any sense. These are folks that are paying taxes, that have jobs that are essential to our community, whether it's working in a grocery store or being, at a hospital as a health aide. These folks deserve and need the assistance that we are providing across the board. And so I think I was disappointed that the DC Council didn't act on this. I think if I were on the DC Council, this is something I would push for. Councilmember Alyssa Silverman has been leading the charge on this on the council. I'm very proud to say that she has endorsed my campaign. I can't wait to work for her on the council on issues like this. And more broadly, when it comes to putting workers first, look, I have spent my career fighting for the values and the priorities that drive the labor movement. We all should be able to live, work, and retire with dignity. And as you say, the COVID-19 crisis has exposed so many vulnerabilities that we have for workers in DC. I'm really proud that I have the support and endorsement in this campaign of many of the workers, these workers who are driving our economy and are essential right now. That's the hotel workers of Unite Here, that's the healthcare workers of SEIU 1199, the transit workers of the Amalgamated Transit Union, the Washington Teachers Union, the Nonprofit Employees Union, and the Labor Council of the AFL-CIO. And I bring that up because it's right now, it is so essential that we stand with our workers. We make sure that we're protecting them. But it's not just right now. We need to make sure we're taking action over time. This eventually, I know it doesn't feel like it right now, COVID-19 will not be the only story in the headline, and yet a lot of these issues will still exist. So I think we need to really prioritize things like wage theft prevention, protecting folks from things like sexual harassment in the workplace, and modernizing our unemployment system and expanding it to make sure it's covering all of our workers. So in DC, we have a massive wage theft problem. For example, we have a great law that was passed a few years ago, and yet the Just Pay Coalition did an analysis of it and said, look, it's not being enforced. We don't have folks on the ground making sure that we have protections. In DC, we also had Initiative 77 to make sure we had one fair wage. The council overturned the will of the people, led by Jack Evans, by the way, our disgraced former council member in Ward 2. But they said, look, we're going to pass all these alternative things and it'll be fine. Well, you know what? They didn't fund or implement them. And so I think what we really need on the council is not someone who will say the right thing, but someone who will actually stand with workers and prioritize their needs in everything that they do.
Okay, thank you. Last question. The coronavirus pandemic has brought to the forefront issues of systemic inequalities in DC. We know that 76% of COVID-related deaths, that's as of April 14th, in DC were Black residents, but Black residents only make up 49% of the district population. What do you see as some of the underlying factors contributing to those disparities, and what would you do to tackle them?
Yeah, this is such a great question. Look, one of the big reasons I'm running is because even before COVID-19, we were at an inflection point as a ward and as a city. We were at risk of becoming a place where only the very wealthy could afford to live. And we saw that as, DC is experiencing one of the highest rates of gentrification and displacement of any city in the country. It doesn't have to be this way. I think in this election in particular, we can make choices to go a different way. We can build a more equitable and inclusive and affordable ward and city for all of us. And that starts with addressing the racial and health and economic disparities that we've seen exposed even more starkly in COVID-19 head on. They didn't just emerge in COVID-19, but they've been made so much clearer. And so I think the way we address that is we invest in the type of structural needs that every worker and family in DC needs. That is making it easier. It starts making it easier to afford a place to live, right? It starts with making it so that you can have a safe place that you can afford for your child to go for childcare. I mean, we have childcare centers that are being threatened with closure after COVID-19, and already we're seeing more that it's $24,000 on average to send an infant to childcare in DC. That's like one of the highest in the country, and it's just not realistic for so many folks. And the flip side of it is also really bad, right? We have disproportionately our childcare workforce are women and women of color, and yet they're paid less than what is considered extremely low income in DC. So how do you afford a place to live? How do you take action to protect your family in the middle of a pandemic and all this stuff when you're not even getting paid a living wage in normal circumstances, let alone in the COVID-19 crisis? Another thing that happens over and over again is we don't have equity when it comes to transportation and getting around. So many of our neighborhoods, like such as in Ward 7 and 8 across the river, have been systematically experiencing transit inequity. And so you can't get around. You can't find a way other than ways that don't really work or aren't helpful. And then, on a related point, we have massive health inequity, partially because we have such a lack of healthcare resources where they're needed most. So, right now, you cannot deliver a baby in an obstetrics ward east of the river because the United Medical Center obstetrics ward was closed down. We have folks we don't have a top level trauma center in Ward 7 and 8. That's just wrong. We need to make sure we're addressing the needs of folks. And so when we see these racial inequities be exposed in COVID-19, where more of the deaths and more of the patients are communities of color, Black and brown folks, it shouldn't surprise us. And it's not going to be just talking points. It's going to be truly investing in a more equitable and inclusive city for years to come in everything that we do.
I'm Daniel Hernandez, and I'm running for DC Council in Ward 2 and the Democratic primary on June 2nd. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a Marine Corps Afghan vet. I'm a father of 2. I live in DuPont Circle, and I work in technology, and I've been at Microsoft for a little over 7 years. I'm running because it's clear, particularly as the coronavirus situation is brought to light, we need bold leadership and people that are willing to do the right thing and stand up and, do what's right and not just what's politically expedient. I think as you take a look at me and you take a look at my background and my history, you can trust that I'm someone who will stand to do the right thing and is in this to work for a better community and to work for you. Thank you.
Great. Set it up. Okay. So, all right, so here's the first question. Approximately 90,000 families live in apartments that are under DC's rent control program, which is currently up for reauthorization. The DC Council's temporary universal ban on all rent increases exposes the need for increased tenant protections. What changes would you make, if any, to DC's rent control laws?
Sure. I'm actually, familiar with the rent control reform movement and the platform. And there's a number of those proposals, I'd say probably a majority of those proposals that I support. To call out some in particular, things like ending voluntary agreements, which have been shown do not work out well for the people involved, and incentivize landlords to then push tenants out so they can raise rents on the next tenants drastically. I'd also like to see stepped up enforcement of habitable living standards. So, kind of beefing up the Attorney General's office ability to investigate and prosecute those cases. I think a good model or example of that is, I think it was earlier this year, maybe towards the end of last year, where there was a property that the Attorney General's office actually took into receivership because the landlord failed to keep the place, I guess, just basically decently livable. And that's something that we definitely should be doing more of. I do like some of the ideas around capital reserve requirements to fund repairs. Um, and generally, I'd say the kind of consumer protection angled policies within rent control or the rent control platform are those that I favor. I mean, to be transparent, there are some things that, I do have a little more questions on, just based on what I've seen of research about the impact to housing supply, because I don't want to do something that, helps us in the next few years and then leaves a bigger problem for our children in 20 or 30 years. We have to do something that, works for the people who need help now and something that doesn't leave us a bigger problem down the line.
Great, thank you. Go ahead and reset. So the next question is, the City Council has enacted legislation that prohibits rent increases during the state of emergency and prohibits evictions until 30 days after the public health crisis has been ended. We know that nationally, a third of tenants could not pay rent on April 1st. And given that well over 72,000 DC workers have filed for unemployment in the last month, that statistic may be higher in the district. While the courts in DC are closed to the public, landlords continue to file eviction cases online so that they'll be able to push evictions through as soon as possible. As the crisis continues, tenants will continue to fall behind on their rent and accrue debt. What would you do to address this crisis if you were on the council now?
Sure. I think we need to have some requirements around, what do payment plans look like? What are landlords required to adjust? I would like to see, particularly for the smaller landlords, like, a family or someone that, just owns one property or maybe they rent out some rooms, that we also account for the other side of that. And we should be suspending mortgage payments for landlords whose tenants are impacted by the coronavirus situation. I guess one of the most straightforward ideas that I've seen for that I like is the idea of just extending the mortgage term, by however long they have to delay or they're not able to make payments. That does, somebody's out money at some point, but I think that's the most sustainable and the most available way to do it beyond, our broader efforts of ensuring we're providing enough cash assistance to those impacted by the coronavirus situation, through the unemployment system and through the extra payments, particularly for, the undocumented workers who may not have access to some of those tools. We also need to figure out as the district, how do we help those, still affected and don't have access to all those other tools or all those other resources. I think it's simply we need to have a priority or a principle that, we're not going to allow the coronavirus situation or the shutdown to force people, out of their homes.
Great, thank you. The DC Housing Authority states that.
Sorry, I just missed a few seconds of audio.
Okay, that's okay. So thank you. The next question is about public housing. The DC Housing Authority states that the 6,600 plus units of public housing need up to $2.5 billion in deferred maintenance and capital improvements. The agency has charted a 20-year redevelopment plan. What would you like to see happen in public housing, and what would you do?
The biggest thing I'd like to see is a very broad approach like Charles Allen has proposed for the Greenleaf development in Southeast, where they've identified another site that, or I guess it's still a proposal, where they would like to identify a site to build a replacement building that at a minimum keeps, the same space of affordable housing, the same mix of family-sized units, multi-bedroom units, and then they build that building. It also includes, market rate housing. I do think mixed income developments, definitely should be the future of, this kind of housing and how we address just the drastic need that we have for this. I also think it's a way to prevent us from ever getting in this situation again where we have a massive amount of housing stock that's just been neglected for 10, 20, 30 years. So we build a new housing unit that at a minimum maintains the existing affordability, ideally expands upon it, also brings some new housing along. You move the residents from the existing building over, then you tear down the existing building and you redevelop that into something else, in kind of a chain of getting people into new buildings, but having that building that they move to first, because we've seen the studies that show that even if we give the right to return or the guarantee or the vouchers, a lot of people still miss out, and they lose out on that and they don't actually return. So I think that's the long-term or the big approach. In the immediate term, we do need to look for funding resources to provide, just some of the dire necessary fixes. Some of those are fairly easy, like fixing a door, fixing a door handle, fixing some windows. But as someone who, I guess, grew up in a working class neighborhood and grew up with asthma, I guess my whole family had asthma, or at least my brothers and I. We have to be concerned about the quality of the living conditions that they're in right now. The redevelopment plan sets us up for the future, but we have to help people who are, whose health are suffering, who are getting sick. We're seeing higher rates of asthma and allergies and so on. We can't just let that fester. So we have to do more to fund and make sure that those necessary repairs and cleanliness happens.
Great, thanks. So next question is on homelessness. From encampment clearings to the threat of COVID outbreaks in shelters, we know that DC's homeless services programs are not working for many residents. How would you ensure that all DC residents have safe, quality, and affordable housing?
I think this actually ties quite a bit into just our overall housing struggles here in DC. I do think, we've shown that the best model to address homelessness is with a housing first model. And to do that effectively, there simply needs to be more housing available. So in the district, we need to produce more housing. We need to be able to set aside more of that for, affordable and deeply affordable housing, and, transitional housing for people to come off the, have a place to stay off the street, and then, follow up with the wraparound services. There are some other communities in the country, and some of those are even larger than DC, that have, I guess, been certified or claimed to have functionally ended permanent homelessness, like Bergen County and New Jersey. In addition to, putting resources into the program, one of the things that they did that I really like is they worked across, all the partners that are involved in helping, people struggling with homelessness. And they put together an information dashboard that everyone, they can then track the residents, they can track the cases, and they can make sure that everyone's getting all the services that they need, and they can identify when a piece of the puzzle is missing. And I think that's something that we can do here in DC. And there's lots of areas, particularly coming from technology, that I think we're a bit behind on, and there are a lot of efficiencies, and we can get a lot better at oversight and tracking if we learn to leverage technology in a better way. And between putting more resources and putting together some of these processes to make sure we're taking a comprehensive approach, I think will do wonders for the program. Like one of the, I guess, examples of this, in Northwest DC, up in Ward 3, there was a building that, I believe about half of the building ended up being vouchered residents. But, it was documented with news articles and reporters, how the district failed to follow up with, a lot of the counseling or a lot of the mental health services, the on-site assistance. So there were a lot of people really struggling, and the other people in the building were quite impacted as well. And it's just unfortunate that we can't just be more effective with these things.
Great, you got it right at the time. The next question is the 1 minute question. So we've talked about DC's affordable housing crisis with respect to rent control, public housing, and homelessness. Either with these or others issues, what would be your top 3 priorities related to housing as a council member? And you can just list them.
Sure. So top 3 priorities for housing. One, of course, is addressing our housing shortage or housing shortfall. Job growth until coronavirus has been outpacing housing growth for a long time, for decades now. And that's just a recipe for the situation that we're in right now, or I guess we're in until a couple months ago. I would also like to see us reform, a lot of the, like I said, let's say consumer protections, of people who are in rent-controlled units, like we talked about in the previous question. And I would like to see us be more effective and efficient and committed to addressing the homelessness, that we have here in DC, particularly in Ward 2, which sees a lot of, I guess quite a bit of it just in day-to-day walking around.
The impact of the coronavirus has revealed a lack of a real safety net for workers in DC, particularly undocumented people and those working in informal and gig economy. So just how would you address these issues?
One of the things that we have to do is ensure that our unemployment system, similar to how here in the coronavirus situation, we've already defined to expand it to account for these workers. These are the kind of reforms that we need to keep after, we finally get through this epidemic. I think that's actually true around a lot of the things that we're doing in response to the coronavirus epidemic is, it's really shined a light on some of these long-standing problems that, we actually have to solve. And just because it's only affected a, let's say, relatively small portion of society, doesn't mean we can ignore it and ignore the pain that, real people are living. Similarly, for undocumented workers, it's obviously the federal government, particularly under this administration, is not helping. And it's somewhere that, we just have a moral responsibility to our residents, to our community, to make sure that, we're helping them and that they're accounted for. They're a part of the community. They are taxpayers. It's just, we can't leave them behind. We can't forget them. We can't leave them out.
Great. So last question. The coronavirus pandemic has brought to the forefront issues of systemic inequalities in DC. We know that about 80% of COVID-19 related deaths in DC have been Black residents, who only make up about 47% of the population. What do you see as some of the underlying factors contributing to these disparities, and what would you do to tackle them?
Sure. I think a lot of the disparities, that have come in the health outcomes in, this coronavirus epidemic, are due to some long-running socioeconomic disparities. I think, in particular, the Black population in DC, through segregation, through redlining, through still the legacy of slavery and, the Jim Crow era across much of the country is something that we've just never corrected for, something that we've never, or we haven't made a sufficient effort to repair the harm. And it's something that we've continued to be terrible about in the past 30 or 40 years of the war on drugs. and the harms that we've seen due to lower income communities across the country. So a lot of the things that I think we need to do are, as we talk about health outcomes, is just broadly addressing some of these systemic inequalities. So some of these things are, we need better educational opportunities. We need better job training and employment and placement programs. Like some of the things in particular, we need like vocational programs, and some of the things that like electrician apprenticeships. And one of, I guess, areas that's relatively new in the past 10 or 15 years that I think we also need to leverage are, things like coding boot camps, and making those available to students, or, post high school. College isn't the answer for everyone. And, we need to leverage and provide those programs to help more people get, sustainable middle class, livable, wages and lives. In addition to that, I think as someone who grew up in a lower income school and neighborhood, I think I'm very personally familiar with a lot of the things that we need to do. The kids who are struggling at home and then are struggling at school. I think I'm very familiar with what we need to do to help them to kind of break the cycle of trauma that they've been in for generations. We need to make sure our kids, as much as is possible through outside help, are happy, healthy, and fed. I think a lot of positive outcomes, even outside of just education, follow along after that.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to answer these questions. I know that there's a lot of interest in issues, especially around housing. My name is Patrick Kennedy. I am currently an advisory neighborhood commissioner in Foggy Bottom, and I'm running for the role of Ward 2 council member, both as a Democratic candidate in the June 2nd primary election, as well as in the special election on June 16th to fill the remaining 6 months of the term this year. I've been an ANC commissioner for the past 8 years here in Foggy Bottom. I've served 5 terms on the commissions as the commission's chair, and I'm very proud of the work that we've done at the neighborhood level, and really even beyond our neighborhood, around a lot of these issues that I think are central to people's concerns in light of the COVID pandemic in particular. But whether it's questions around affordable housing or people experiencing homelessness, whether it's schools activism. The very first thing that I got involved with at the neighborhood level was saving our school in the neighborhood from closure, and seeing it really thrive over the past 7 years has given me a great deal of confidence in the value of public education more generally, and certainly in Ward 2 specifically. So grateful for the opportunity, and would very much appreciate the support of your viewers in the coming 2 elections.
Great, that was great. And you could see the 15-second sign, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'll just give you that 15-second heads up if you are approaching your time. Okay, so the first question. Approximately 90,000 families live in apartments that are under DC's rent control program, which is currently up for reauthorization. The DC Council's temporary universal ban on all rent increases exposes the need for increased tenant protections. What changes, if any, would you make to DC's rent control laws?
Yeah, I think rent control is a pivotal protection for a lot of long-term tenants, especially in our city. And I will say that I'm speaking and answering this question from the confines of a rent controlled apartment. I have lived in rent controlled apartments in Foggy Bottom ever since I moved off campus when I was a student at GW. And I will say, and I use this story sometimes to illustrate the value that I see of rent control, is when I moved into my very first apartment building off campus, I was running for the Advisory Neighborhood Commission at that time, and I got to know a neighbor who lived 2 floors up from me, who worked as a paralegal downtown, earned a modest salary, certainly nothing that was, provided an ornate standard of living. But for the exact same unit, basically, that I had, she paid 1/3 of the cost that I did. And that protection, that accrued savings that rent stabilization provided her, allowed her to stay in Foggy Bottom. And that's really why we have a lot of middle-class people in our neighborhood, especially and seniors who've been able to age in places that they have been protected from large rent increases. So when I announced my campaign almost 14 months ago, from day one of the things that I said that I wanted to do was expand rent control protections to buildings built after 1975. I think it's very important that our rent control program not be static, that it take into account all of the new construction, because there are a number of different trends going on in the city that are really having a negative effect on our ability to stabilize rents. One is that a lot of units are going out of the rent control inventory just through conversions and other processes like that. I think that we need to utilize the District Opportunity to Purchase Act and some other covenant type measures that we can put in place to just preserve units and prevent them from being displaced. But the other thing is that a smaller and smaller proportion of our housing stock is under rent control protection as so much new construction has come online, particularly in the last decade and a half, I think in the city in particular. So we need to have a dynamic date to enroll buildings in rent control. I think that it's potentially appropriate to build in a market rate window so as not to discourage rental housing production. I think the last thing we need is to constrain supply further, but we absolutely need there to be a date certain for every building in the city in which there would be rent control protections enrolled. I also think it's very important that we scrutinize better a lot of the existing practices that were probably written into the law, I think, for good intention, but have just been exploited as loopholes. Hardship petitions are one example of that. There are hardship petitions that are filed, I think, if not fraudulently, then certainly skirting the bounds of what those were actually intended to provide for, which would certainly be smaller landlords in particular. So we need to crack down on hardship petition abuse especially, and look especially at some of how we calculate the formulas for rates of return and rental increase year over year to make sure that it's a sufficient protection.
Next question. This is a kind of a long one. The City Council has enacted legislation that prohibits rent increases during the state of emergency and prohibits evictions until 30 days after the public health crisis has ended. We know that nationally 1/3 of tenants could not pay their rent on April 1st. Given that over 87,000 DC workers have filed for unemployment in the last month, that statistic may be higher in the district. While the courts in DC are closed to the public, landlords continue to file eviction cases online so that they can push evictions through as soon as possible. As the crisis continues, tenants will continue to fall behind on their rent and accrue a debt. What would you do to address this if you were on the DC Council?
Well, I certainly hope when it comes to evictions and eviction cases that have been pre-filed, that in a lot of cases, hopefully that's a procedural step that they don't intend to follow through on. Because I also don't understand how it's in their self-interest to do so. We're looking at a situation where we have a significant portion of residents in the city that are out of work. And it's not like you can throw somebody out of their home at this point and replace them with somebody who is flush and ready to and able to pay the rent. We would be dealing with significant vacancy that would trickle up through the market. And so I think it's really in everyone's best interest to work through repayment plans. And I know that the council has taken some constructive steps in legislation, I think that's proposed for next week, as far as requiring that repayment plans be offered. What they have not been specific about is what the repayment plans would actually be, much less the duration over which repayments can be scheduled. I don't necessarily think that we should be relying on the grace and favor of landlords to totally determine the conditions that tenants can come up to current payment status on their rent. So, one of the things that I would like to look at, for instance, in the context of that bill, is looking at the duration of the public health emergency and saying, for the equivalent amount of time that the public health emergency has passed, we will give you at least that amount of time. And I say at least, to get caught up on your rent. So if it's a 3-month or if it's a 6-month public health emergency, the repayment plan is at least 3 or 6 months beyond that date. I think that the city can also do a lot, especially through direct relief to renters. The federal government's relief capacity, I think, is greater than the city's because they can deficit spend and do some things that we can't, but we can certainly fill in the holes, I think, where federal relief has fallen short. The stimulus package, I think, that's been passed so far is inadequate. The $1,200 check, I will tell you, I spend half of my income on rent. That would not cover 1 month's rent for me. Even with the enhanced unemployment compensation, it's just very difficult with the cost of housing the way that it is in this city right now for people really to make themselves whole just based on the relief that has been offered so far. So certainly if we're providing relief to landlords, whether that's in the form of property tax relief or direct payments to property owners, certainly if we're providing those forms of relief, we need mandatory provisions in there that relief be passed on to tenants and renters. I know the council has taken some steps to doing that at the very beginning, but we can't rely on just, I think, bailing out the property class in this city. And I don't say that pejoratively, but we can't just expect that the benefits are going to trickle down. So I think it's a combination of not only relief directly to renters, but making sure that we set the regulations and conditions in place where landlords are going to take the steps necessary to be fair in context of the current crisis.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next question. The DC Housing Authority states that 6,600 plus units of public housing need up to $2.5 billion in deferred maintenance and capital improvements, and the agency has charted a 20-year redevelopment plan. What would you like to see happen in public housing, and what would you do?
I think it's a huge imperative for the city because the condition of our public housing stock is really pretty shameful. I mean, I think for any large city, and certainly for the capital city of the country, it poses environmental issues for the tenants, especially in some of these older buildings with some cases mold that you're seeing or conditions that exacerbate asthma conditions. So, you know, we have an immediate need, and I think there is a sense of urgency that needs to be brought to bear around resolving this question. I think so far what's been floated from the Housing Authority is a public-private partnership. I'm not altogether opposed to that, but I think that we absolutely need to make sure that the city doesn't get taken to the cleaners in that process. I think sometimes in the past when it's been a public-private partnership, you know, the private partner makes sure that they're going to ultimately be made whole in the end, and the public takes on the risk. And we can't have an arrangement like that. You know, that having been said, $2.5 billion is a very tall order for the city to fund. In context, you know, our local budget is $6 billion a year. So it is a tall task, and I think it's very unfortunate that the Federal Housing and Urban Development Department has really stepped back from a lot of their obligations, I think, in bringing resources to bear to help cities. A lot of public housing stock in this country clearly was built in the post-World War II era, and HUD was responsible for a lot of that construction. They should be responsible for a lot of the maintenance and renovation. So hopefully under a Democratic administration, we will get a HUD department that's a little more generous as far as providing assistance. But assuming that we have to take this obligation on in large part locally, I think that we can leverage private capital, but we do need to make sure that a couple of conditions are absolutely secured for tenants. One, there needs to be a guaranteed and meaningful right of return for existing tenants. We can't have buildings that are demolished and then the land just sits vacant for 10 years and people create new lives elsewhere. That's displacement through the back door. So we need to operate using build first principles. A lot of housing authority sites, you know, were made in the sort of garden apartment style that was very common in the 50s or 60s. So there is land available on a lot of sites to begin new developments before tearing down or instead of tearing down existing buildings. So I would support moving forward with those sorts of principles, certainly. I'd like to increase density on our public housing sites because I think that we optimally need to be increasing the number of public housing units. There are a lot of people who are just not served by market rate housing conditions in this city and never will be. You look at the genesis of public housing, and it was really created in this country in response to housing shortages during the Second World War, and it served not just lower income people, but the middle classes too. So I would like a mixed income model in our public housing and on public housing properties so that we're providing more tenants or more relief, not just for the lower, but the middle classes who are just not being served by the existing market forces.
Great, thank you. Okay, from encampment clearing to the threat of COVID outbreaks in shelters, we know that DC's homeless services programs are not working for many residents. How would you ensure that all DC residents have safe, quality, and affordable housing?
It's an excellent question, and it's multifaceted. I think when you're encountering people who are experiencing homelessness, you need to understand the issue, first of all, as a human problem, and everybody's circumstances are going to be different. So the solution that works best for each individual is going to be different. You know, that having been said, I think clearly our homelessness crisis in the city is a product of the lack of affordable housing that we have. I don't think it's a coincidence that the number of people experiencing homelessness in our city has generally tracked with the increase in housing costs. So a lot of it comes back to how we address the housing crisis, and specifically, as I outlined in my answer to the public housing question, how we care for people who are just being left behind from the present market conditions. We need to be creating new units of housing at every single price point in this city, because supply is just so far outmatched by demand in this city. So, but especially, I think, building on the public housing answer, there are a lot of things that we can do for people on a long-term basis by investing in local rent supplements, by investing in targeted affordable housing vouchers, by working with property owners and landlords to find more places that are willing partners in this effort and who will take housing vouchers. I think that it's very important that we have affirmative fair housing goals as a city, and that we create an opportunity for our existing voucher holders to live in any neighborhood of this city. I think it's really important that we have income diversity in our communities. Along that line, I would say that, certainly we also need to make investments in permanent supportive housing, because there are folks who are experiencing homelessness who have underlying issues, be they substance abuse or mental health. And we need to make sure that we're setting them up in conditions where they can succeed and live an independent life. In a lot of cases, that entails wraparound services and having a caseworker that's going to help them with their capability to live independently. A lot of it, at the very front end, as far as, getting people into these sorts of programs that's right for them, is we need to improve our shelter system. We need to improve our shelter system as the very first place that people go when they end up in a position where they're on the street. And we need to make sure that they live in safe and hospitable surroundings while they're waiting for the district government to identify the resources that are best for them. So that entails having smaller shelters, I think, than the large congregate sleeping settings that we have in a lot of our shelters now. It entails having, I think, more co-ed shelters for couples. It entails having more pet-friendly shelters. And I think it takes understanding that high barrier shelters are not necessarily the most constructive if we want to get people back on their feet who are otherwise experiencing a lot of challenges. We should not make our shelter system punitive. I think that's the mindset that a lot of these shelters have been created for, is that, you just want to make the conditions bad enough that people get out as quickly as possible. And that just doesn't work as a strategy. So we need to address this on many fronts.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now is the 1-minute question. So we've talked about DC's affordable housing crisis with respect to rent control, public housing, and homelessness. What would be your top 3 priorities related to housing as a council member? And you can just, go ahead and list them.
Yeah, no, I think that certainly as we look to reauthorize rent control, it is up for reauthorization this year. We need to get rent control right. And like I mentioned at the top, especially expanding it and setting a dynamic date moving forward so that we don't constantly have to adjust, what year buildings are in, what year they're not. 1975 isn't a magic number. So we need to get that dynamic date in place and look at rent control as we reauthorize it this year. I think the second, which I alluded to briefly, is we need to do a lot better job of preserving existing units of housing affordability than we are now. We have not exercised the District Opportunity to Purchase Act. In many cases, tenants, although they have TOPA rights, will assign their rights to a third-party developer who often makes as a condition of their purchase that tenants essentially sign away the rights of future tenants. So we need the district to step in a lot of those cases. And I think the third priority, getting back to the previous question, is, how do we deal with people who are experiencing homelessness and finding the program that's right for them, and especially rejuvenating our shelter system.
Great, thank you. Okay, so 2 more questions. The impacts of the coronavirus have also revealed the lack of a real safety net for workers in DC, particularly undocumented workers and those working in the informal and gig economy. How would you address these issues?
I think that the question is spot on as far as the current crisis really spotlighting where there are holes that predated this and where there are things that we can do a lot better. I think, the federal government does have enhanced unemployment insurance. I know that the district is trying through the Department of Employment Services to make sure that the existing programs are accessible to those who might not qualify for traditional unemployment insurance, where the employer pays in, the employee can claim after a certain period. I think we've been through that process in fits and starts so far. I mean, these are the sorts of things where we need to evaluate the district's role vis-a-vis the federal government. I think a lot of the federal programs that have been designed aren't really serving these gaps very well. So as we look at the resources that we have as a government, which are admittedly far more constrained than the federal government, we need to be looking at supplementing and filling the gaps where the federal relief just doesn't exist. And so I think that's especially expanding unemployment insurance relief to gig workers and making sure that those benefits last as long as there is a slowdown in economic activity, because those aren't necessarily people who will be recalled to work, recalled from a furlough on a date certain. They are the type of people who will only return to work when people start taking Ubers and Lyfts again, or freelance work picks up and things like that. And that's just not as much of a certain date as, somebody who is recalled to work. So we need to make sure that unemployment type benefits, continue to be available and they're rolled out in a user-friendly way to those classes, and that those benefits are available as long as necessary. Because, the most important thing that we can do in this crisis is keep everybody solvent. Just float everyone for the duration of this crisis. Make sure that businesses and residents have the capital that they need to get through this, to pay their bills. Because if we don't, then both workers and businesses are going to be in dire straits, and we will have not just short-term job losses, not just short-term foreclosures and missed bills and bankruptcies, but this will be a long-term issue that spirals out of control many years in the future. So if we shortchange relief efforts now, it will have a long-term impact. I was pleased to see that Events DC came up with a plan to make sure, especially that undocumented workers were taken care of. They are the backbone in many cases, and the hidden backbone that a lot of people don't see of our service economy. So we need to make sure that Events DC's $5 million fund is durable and that they have the flexibility to expand that. I know that they're working with partner organizations to try to find a pass-through to make sure that that money gets to the folks who need it. A lot of undocumented people, for very understandable reasons, do not want to necessarily make themselves well known, I think, for government services. So it's important that that money get into the hand of service providers that they trust, and that we supplement that as necessary in the future to make sure that those workers and their families are taken care of for the duration of the pandemic.
Great, thanks. So this is the last question here. The coronavirus pandemic has brought to the forefront issues of systemic inequalities in DC. We know that 79% of the COVID-19 related deaths, that was as of April 14th, but I think that percentage is still the same, in DC were Black residents who make up only 46% of the population. What do you see as some of the underlying factors contributing to these disparities, and what would you do to tackle them?
I think, there are certainly underlying disparities that you can identify that directly correlate to the case incidence and the mortality rate. And I think that's a couple of different things. I think, first of all, more African-American residents proportionately, probably than white residents in the city, perform essential jobs and have to report to work and expose themselves to conditions where they might come into contact with somebody transmitting the virus. Certainly that's healthcare workers, but that's also bus drivers, public safety employees. I think what you would find is just that a disproportionate amount of the African-American residents in the city, in contrast to white collar workers, and white working professionals, aren't necessarily in telework jobs as much. And so I think that's a real question on the front end, is how much we're exposing our essential workers to the coronavirus. And a lot of that comes back to, I think, making sure that economic opportunity and jobs opportunity is the same for every single population in the city, and that we don't have people who are concentrated in particular sectors of employment or feel like their opportunities are constricted because of inequities in education, inequities in job training, and a lot of the other things that I think predated this, certainly, but have been very much brought to the fore by it. Another thing is certainly our healthcare system. Our healthcare system is very unequal in the city. When you look at the number of services that are offered in the western part of the city, frankly, my ward and my neighborhood area with GW Hospital and others in the western part of the city, and the healthcare infrastructure that you would find in Wards 7 and 8, frankly, where some of the case rates are highest. I think it's Ward 4, Ward 7, and Ward 8 are some of the highest, maybe 5 trails slightly behind that. But I don't think that it's any coincidence that those cases also correlate to where we don't have a healthcare network in place. So it's not just a matter of moving forward with a new hospital at St. Elizabeth's, but it's really putting backing, especially, and most importantly, into the community clinics that have been set up as part of that deal in Ward 7 and 8, because we also need to be addressing chronic conditions and some of the things that the coronavirus maybe exacerbates, but doesn't necessarily produce in its own right. So it's not just, that somebody comes into the hospital with symptoms of COVID-19. It's that COVID-19 has exacerbated some of their immune system deficiencies and other things, that we see just as latent healthcare disparities. So it's about expanding access, especially to preventative medicine, making sure that people can come in for regular checkups, making sure that the clinics are in the community and broadly accessible. I think DC has done a very good job in relation to other jurisdictions in terms of making healthcare insurance more accessible to people, through DC Medicaid, through the Healthcare Alliance. But ultimately, there are only still certain providers that will take Medicaid just because of the low reimbursement rates. So the district is going to have an ongoing role in subsidizing access to care to make sure that lower income residents and African American residents on the eastern side of the city have access to quality providers wherever they live.
I'm Brooke Pinto. I'm running to represent Ward 2 on the DC Council in the primary election June 2nd and the special election on June 16th. I previously worked at the DC Office of the Attorney General, first as a tax attorney representing the DC Office of Tax and Revenue, and most recently was the Assistant Attorney General for Policy and Legislative Affairs. And in that role, I was representing the DC Council and many of the district agencies. I'm very proud to have the endorsement of our Attorney General, Carl Racine, as well as the endorsement of the Washington Post. And I'm really looking forward to partnering together so we can really meaningfully address our affordable housing crisis in the city, both for our current units as well as for our homeless population.
So the first question is, approximately 9,000 families live in apartments that are under approximately 90,000 families live in apartments that are under DC's rent control program, which is currently up for reauthorization. The DC Council's temporary universal ban on rent increases exposes the need for increased tenant protections. What changes, if any, would you make to DC's rent control laws?
So, given the crisis of COVID-19, I am hopeful that this presents us with an opportunity to really reimagine what's possible with our rent control laws and our affordable housing crisis. And so I'm hoping that as many more people are starting to say, oh my goodness, people aren't able to afford their rent right now in the short term because we're in a crisis, that reminds us that many families have been in a crisis for much longer than this crisis, and hoping that we can continue on that type of thinking even as we start to rebuild and recover. Our current rent control laws, as you know, are from 1975, and so it's definitely time for an update based on the current situation we are in 2020. 38% of the units have been removed from rent control since 1975, and so updating the date makes a lot of sense, as well as closing a lot of the loopholes around voluntary agreements and other ways that landlords have found to increase the rent that may not be directly from the monthly rent, but for other utility charges or other associated expenses that we've found. I think there needs to be an increase in enforcement of the law so that landlords are held responsible when they do violate the actual terms and the intent of the agreement, but that the law itself needs to be made stronger so that our tenants can know what they are signing up for and be protected from unnecessary increases over time.
Great, thank you. The next question, the City Council has enacted legislation that prohibits rent increases during the state of emergency and prohibits evictions until 30 days after the public health crisis has been ended. We know that nationally, nearly a third of tenants could not pay their rent on April 1st. And given that over 87,000 DC workers have filed for unemployment in the last month, that statistic may be higher in the district. While the courts in DC are closed to the public, landlords continue to file eviction cases online so they can push evictions through as soon as possible. We know that was just changed, but until yesterday, that was the case, right? As the crisis continues, tenants will continue to fall behind on their rent and accrue a debt. What would you do to address this crisis if you were on the council now?
So I think that a lot of this stems from putting choice into the hands of the renters. And so I believe that we need to increase our vouchers, not just for the current voucher recipients, but make sure that our current renters are empowered to pay their rent now. Because if we continue to defer payments, people aren't making income. And so 6 months from now, they're not going to be able to pay 6 months worth of rent. And so I think we need to empower our current renters to enable them to keep paying their rent and keep the entire operation running so that we don't have a deferred problem, and so that those landlords don't either leave town or renege on their obligations to maintain the building. I think that the no evictions rule during this crisis is great, and that needs to be improved upon. I used to work at the Landlord Tenant Resource Center, and we saw all the time people have no legal representation, no understanding of where to go for resources if they do fall behind on a rent payment. And we shouldn't be criminalizing poverty. We need to make sure that people are empowered to pay and know where to go when they are unable to do so. It's not benefiting anyone in the city to continue evicting all of our residents who are unable to make their rent payments and then provide no additional support for them when those evictions take place. So it's really going to be a holistic challenge. So that's the first place I would start. The no debt collections and freeze on mortgage payments, I'm in support of, and think those programs need to be extended just for farther than just these 30 days, because this crisis is going to persist, unfortunately, I think for at least the rest of the year, and we may have a second wave of the virus in the fall or the winter, and we need to be prepared for that longer term reality and protect our tenants and residents now. I think that there are some other interesting ways we can defer our real property taxes for certain buildings, certain renters, certain small businesses, so that people aren't going out of business or having to move because they can't pay their real property taxes right now. Again, I think a straight deferment doesn't seem to make much sense, because people won't have that income in 4 or 5 months. And so that deferment may need to be for a whole other year. It may need to be a complete freeze and find other avenues of revenue to make up for that shortfall so we can continue paying for our programs in this city. And I want to improve the grants that we provide for representation for landlords and tenants at the Landlord-Tenant Court and Superior Court, and bolster a lot of the work that's already being done by some of our legal services organizations.
Great, thank you. Good use of your time. The DC Housing Authority states that 6,600 plus units of public housing need $2.5 billion in deferred maintenance and capital improvements. And the agency has charted a 20-year redevelopment plan. What would you like to see happen in public housing, and what would you do?
So this is a huge issue, and it's one of the many reasons that I am in support of putting choice into the hands of the renter, and to make sure that the voucher recipient has choice when he or she or their family consider where to live. Because what we were seeing was, when that choice is within the purview of the landlord, the conditions of the housing were really uninhabitable. And I'm really grateful for the work of many other organizations like the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless, who I used to volunteer with, to make sure that those buildings are maintained and updated, and that tenants aren't left in inhabitable housing arrangements. We used to do and continue to do work at the DC Attorney General's office to make sure that landlords who are violating their responsibility to update these housing units are penalized, and that there are active investigations to make sure that that's not happening. There needs to be more coordination, I believe, between the other housing agencies as well as DCRA to ensure that when a complaint comes in, it's actually being followed through on. We see this across the government where complaints are made and it seems to fall through the cracks. And that is an oversight challenge, and it's too dangerous to let go. And so that's definitely going to be a major priority of mine. I'm also a believer in housing first policies and making sure that people have access to housing, and then we can provide the additional wraparound services to make sure they are receiving job training, receiving budgetary resources, receiving family resources for their families, and ensure that they can stay on a path to getting reintegrated and maintaining their status as being housed in our society as opposed to operating in such silos.
Great, thank you. From encampment clearings to the threat of COVID outbreaks at shelters, we know that DC's homeless services programs are not working for many residents. How would you ensure that all DC residents have safe, quality, and affordable housing?
Mm-hmm. So one major priority for me in this area is to put a greater focus on those individuals who are making zero income, the 0 to 30% of AMI group that is often overlooked. And if we don't address it now, we will never meaningfully address the chronically homeless problem in our city. I think there's been a large focus on providing supplemental income to folks who are making between $30,000 and $60,000 a year, which are great programs and absolutely need to be maintained to ensure that our city is affordable for a larger group of people. But if we don't address the needs of the group that has no income at the moment, then we will never get them the help that they need and get them on a path to sustained employment and care for physical or mental health challenges and making sure their kids are in school. And so that's a first place I want to start. And I also want to make sure that our agencies are working together. Many of our agencies are well-intended and have similar goals of getting our families in housing and getting people on the right path, but we're operating in silos way too often. And so I think there needs to be a stronger coordination, and that's the responsibility of the council member. So a problem that we see is there are so many agencies in DC focused on housing that oftentimes we have either a duplication of efforts or finding of our individuals and families falling through the cracks. And I think that's a major responsibility of the council member and of the council as a whole to provide meaningful and exacting oversight over all those agencies to make sure that well-intended policies are actually implemented properly and that we're coordinating our efforts together to really meaningfully address this challenge, because it touches everything. Housing touches insurance and employment and education and health, and to operate in such silos doesn't make sense. And I'm hopeful that following and during this crisis of COVID-19, it really presents us with an opportunity to reimagine how we provide more holistic care and resources to our residents and families.
We've talked about DC's affordable housing crisis with respect to rent control, public housing, and homelessness. What would be your top 3 priorities for housing? And you can just list them.
First, homelessness and making sure we have more long-term housing options for people. The rapid rehousing program does not make sense for a 1-year voucher with a 13-year waiting list. And then we're surprised as a city when people end up back on the street. We need to make sure we have long-term housing options for people to then provide more effective wraparound services. 2, more supports for our local organizations that are doing a lot of this important work. As we work to recover from this crisis, public, private, and nonprofit governmental partnerships are going to be very important to get people the resources and help they need. And as a government, we should be doing everything we can to bolster up the important work of those organizations, and a greater focus on mixed income developments. The research demonstrates that we should not be putting people with housing challenges off into one side of the city without access to great transportation options, schools, grocery stores. We should all be living as one in this city, and I think that will address a lot of our problems on a long-term basis going forward.
Great, thank you. So the impacts of coronavirus have also revealed the lack of a real safety net for DC workers, particularly undocumented people and those working in the informal and gig economy. How would you address these issues?
We've seen that the COVID-19 crisis is disproportionately affecting Black and Brown individuals and families, and it's really just awful to see how those inequities are continuing to expand during this time of crisis. I worked on the issue of worker misclassification at the Attorney General's office, which I think is something we need to consider more strongly during this crisis, and that is when many of the employers are identifying or misclassifying their workers as independent contractors in order to skirt the requirements of providing additional benefits. And so that is not just an enforcement issue, but also a preventative issue, and making sure that employers know they have to designate their employees as what they really are, which is almost always workers, and knowing that there's going to be somebody following up to make sure that you are classifying them correctly, and if you don't, there will be penalties. And so I think that that's a first place to start. We need to expand the definition of our essential workers for grocery stores and pharmacists and janitors so that everybody can get the healthcare and the support that they need. We're relying on all these workers to get us through this crisis, as we are being told to stay home and stay safe, and yet a huge group of our population is not staying home and staying safe. They're providing essential services to us. And so as the government, we need to be doing everything we can to providing supports to our essential workers and expand that definition. I also think we need to do much more to protect our undocumented community in DC. Many of these workers continue to provide essential services for us or have been laid off, and we're now telling them we have no additional support for you. If we're going to be a sanctuary city, which I think we should be, we need to put teeth behind that and really mean what we say. And we should have assurances to our undocumented that if you come forward for government benefits, which I do think we need to expand and provide, you will be safe from deportation. And we should only be saying that if it's true. And that's why we need to make sure that we are a true sanctuary city, and why we need to work towards statehood so that we can implement the values that are so reflective across our own city as our jurisdiction, and not be so contingent upon in reliance on the federal government, who often steps in and undermines our own values.
Great, thanks. And the last question, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought to the forefront issues of systemic inequalities in DC. We know that 79% of COVID-19 related deaths in DC were Black residents, who only make up about 46% of the population. What do you see as some of the underlying factors contributing to these disparities, and what would you do to tackle them?
Mm-hmm. And racial inequities in DC are so intertwined, as we know. And I'm very worried to see all of the inequities that continue to persist with this crisis, especially around education. So when we were telling students that everyone's going to move to distance learning, not every student had access to laptops or internet. And not every teacher had access to the training he or she needed to provide meaningful distance learning. And so that is one of the places I would start, is to make sure that all of our students have what they need, and that our teachers have what they need, especially going into the summer months and next school year, where we may have more distance learning and more creative ways to provide instruction to our students, to make sure that's done equitably, to make sure everybody is having access to the internet or more computers, so that we don't make another generation of our kids fall behind and expand those inequities. I think that every piece of legislation should be viewed through the racial equity lens. I'm really happy to see that there's movement and more support around that proposal. I think that that makes a lot of sense. And I am running to represent Ward 2 on the council, and I think in order to do that most effectively, it requires an understanding of what's important to every ward, and it requires an understanding that we are one city. And when we operate, again, as I was talking about the agencies, we operate in such silos or operate just with our parochial interests of our own neighborhoods in mind, it is making our city go backwards. And so I think we have to have a council member who understands these are citywide issues, and to come up with citywide solutions, you have to think through that vantage point. And that's why it's also a major priority of mine to make sure that there are more urgent care centers and hospitals in Ward 7 and 8, or grocery stores in Ward 7 and 8, and educational opportunities in all the wards. Because when we just think about our own neighborhood, we get into big trouble.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you to the Reclaim Rent Control Network. I also really enjoyed our event with TENAC earlier this week. I've long been passionate about tenants' rights, and I've been watching what's going around the country with the rent strikes and the tough situation so many people are having right now. My name is Kishan Putta, and I have a public health background, and so I'm following this crisis very closely. I really appreciate your invitation to join you today. And I've been working on tenants' rights in DC for a long time. I'm especially with the immigrant community. I'm on Mayor Bowser's Asian Pacific Islander Affairs Commission, and so happy AAPI Heritage Month to everyone. But through that role and others, I've been supporting our low-income immigrants across our city, especially with their landlords. And so these issues very much resonate with me personally, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Approximately 90,000 families live in apartments that are under DC's rent control program, which is currently up for reauthorization. The DC Council's temporary universal ban on all rent increases exposes the need for increased tenant protections. What changes, if any, would you make to DC's rent control laws?
Right, and yeah, I absolutely appreciate this question, and your whole platform. I've been following it very closely. I remember last fall I was at the DC for Democracy event where you first presented and strongly support these policies. I do want to tell you, though, before I get started, one of my favorite quotes is, "People don't care what you know until they know that you care." And so I do want to start off telling you why I care so much. My mother and father were born in small villages in India, and they didn't have running water or electricity, but they worked really hard and they made it to this country, and they always taught us to give back, and they were public servants here. And so I've always wanted to help as much as possible. And so that's why I ran for neighborhood commissioner in DuPont Circle, and was able to help a lot of people. That's why I took a pay cut to work for DC government, working to implement Obamacare here in DC to help people get health insurance citywide, and working in all 8 wards. And that was invaluable experience. And that's why I ran for ANC commissioner again. And now I'm running for higher office. But through DC HealthLink and through my work with the Mayor's Commission, I saw how much of a tough time so many people are having in our city, as I mentioned before, with the immigrant community. And I've been fighting for low-income immigrants who are being pushed out by their landlords for many years, to give them support. And so I do believe all people and families deserve high-quality, affordable homes. I support reauthorization of rent control and expanding it as well, and also eliminating loopholes that are misused by landlords, such as the hardship petitions. I think we should expand rent control, as I mentioned, but we can do it incrementally, so that we can do it so we can do it successfully. That way we can move slowly towards progress, not slowly, but incrementally. And I believe that's the best way to transition to it, rather than doing it all at once. But I am with you on the value of it. And I also agree with allowing only 1 rent increase per year, as suggested in your platform. And I also agree with eliminating the vacancy incentive for landlords. On rent control, as I discussed at TENAC earlier this week, I think that the inflation plus 2% provision for landlords, I think that it should be changed. I think that CPI, the inflation index, is imperfect for this purpose.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off, but we are just giving each candidate 3 minutes. And don't feel like you don't have to use the full 3 minutes if you don't need it. But
okay, great.
Totally, but you do have it.
Okay.
Okay, so this next question is kind of long. The City Council has enacted legislation that prohibits rent increases during the state of emergency and prohibits evictions until 30 days after the public health crisis has ended. We know that nationally, 1/3 of renters could not pay their rent on April 1st. given that over 87,000 DC workers have filed for unemployment in the last month. That statistic may be higher in the district. While the courts in DC are closed to the public, landlords continue to file eviction cases online so that they can push evictions through as soon as possible. As the crisis continues, tenants will continue to fall behind on their rent and accrue a debt. What would you do to address this if you were on the council?
Thanks. Yeah, it's been heartbreaking to see the pain that's out there right now. And as I mentioned, I have a public health background. I've worked 15 years on public health here in DC. I've worked for DC government for the last 6 years, as I mentioned, helping people with healthcare across the city. And actually, so I'm following this crisis very closely. And from a public health standpoint, I want to bring that experience and expertise I have to the council so that this is pretty much the biggest problem our city is going to be facing for the next several years, and certainly for the term of this council member seat. So I want to bring that public health experience so that we can reopen safely and carefully so that we don't have future shutdowns that can cause even more disruption and pain. But in the meantime, we need to help people and help support people and workers across our city. And so that is a top priority for me. I have a road to recovery plan on my website. Please check it out at kishan4dc.com. And first and foremost, we need to place a moratorium on all evictions, at least through August or through, well after reopening. And the moratorium should begin with all residential and local commercial tenants. And we need to close all eviction proceedings and stop any new cases from being filed, and allow people to start earning an income so that they can pay their rents. And as we see more and more rent strikes and tensions rising, it's a crucial time to have these candid conversations. And I think we could set up a program to create conversations and dialogue between tenants, rights advocates, and landlords to bring everyone together and to create an understanding and look for solutions during and after this crisis. We need to change how we look at tenant protection and who we prioritize, and this pandemic has given us the opportunity to do so.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, next question. The DC Housing Authority states that the 6,600 plus units of public housing need up to $2.5 billion in deferred maintenance and capital improvements, and the agency has charted a 20-year redevelopment plan. What would you like to see happen in public housing, and what would you do?
Great question. I have, as I mentioned, worked for DC HealthLink citywide in all 8 wards, trying to help the most vulnerable and make sure that they have healthcare access. Through that experience, I've visited several public housing developments across our city in almost every ward, actually, and it's been, I'll never forget what I saw, and that will stick with me through my work to improve public housing. I deeply believe in it. A couple things I'll say. As I mentioned, there's a lot of low-income immigrants are taken advantage of by landlords, and I saw with my own eyes the roach infested homes they had, the fact that they didn't have hot water in the winter, they didn't have air conditioning in the summer, and these are causing major health issues as well that we're all going to have to shoulder as a society. So it makes sense to improve public housing. It's better for everybody, and it's worth the investment. I would support legislation to offer loans for repairs and maintenance to property management companies that offer affordable units. We need to do regular check-ins and monitoring to ensure developers are actually building and affordable units. And essential repairs have to be done, both even during the pandemic and afterwards. And then lastly, the Housing Production Trust Fund dollars, they need to be used a lot better. Recent audits show that they could have produced a lot better low-income housing for those who need it the most. And that's something that's important to me. Oversight of our taxpayer dollars. Use our money the best way to help as many vulnerable people as possible.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that. Okay, question number 4. So from encampment clearings to the threat of COVID outbreaks in shelters, we know that DC's homeless services programs are not working for many residents. How would you ensure that all DC residents have safe, quality, and affordable housing?
Thank you, great. And I've been working on homelessness for a long time. When I was an ANC commissioner in DuPont Circle, there were definitely a lot of homeless neighbors who, you know, there would be residents who would complain about it, but they didn't want to get to the root of the underlying problem. You know, often it was, you know, a lifetime of issues that that people have been experiencing, whether it's family trauma or substance abuse or mental health issues. And that's why I began to investigate it. And I was so happy in 2013 and 2014, I was able to discover Pathways to Housing. The local, they're based out of DC, but their model has been getting so much attention, even nationwide. I believe they were even on 60 Minutes, because their model of housing first is no longer novel, but back in 2013 it was, and I was so impressed. I started to talk about it with everyone I could, and they've been tweaking their model, but making sure residents are given reliable housing first, and then provided with all the services needed to support them so that they can avoid relapse and being homeless once again. And that is what we all want to resolve. We don't want to spend resources and then only to fail the individuals, only to fail our taxpayers. So we need to provide health services, mental health services, nutrition services, substance abuse services, employment services, training services, and more. And Pathways is doing that very well. They are keeping people from going back to homelessness. And we need to support such programs, at least a $40 million investment if possible. I would push for, because really I think it will pay for itself if we can keep these people healthy, rather than having them end up in emergency rooms. We try to save their lives, and it's worse for everyone.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so next is the 1-minute question. So I'll tell you when you have 15 seconds left. But
Okay.
We've talked about DC's affordable housing crisis with respect to rent control, public housing, and homelessness. What would be your top 3 priorities related to housing as a council member? And you can just go ahead and list them.
Okay, sure. I would say top 3. Okay, 1, protecting struggling residents from rent and property tax increases, so everyone, regardless of age or income, has a place in our city. 2, adding highly affordable units in commercial corridors, vacant office space, government-owned buildings. And 3, expanding rent control to more units and closing the rent control loopholes to protect current tenants of all ages, per your guidance. And I'm very glad to have your guidance backing me up on that. And I will rely on it as a council member.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so 2 more questions. Both of them are 3-minute questions. The impact of the coronavirus has also revealed the lack of a real safety net for workers in DC, particularly undocumented workers and those working in the informal and gig economy. How would you address these issues?
Right. And this goes back to my work with the immigrant community. Through DC HealthLink, we reached out to our immigrant community. Actually, 1 out of 4 more than 25% of the people in our city are immigrants or children of immigrants. And actually, if I may say so, our DC Council is not reflective of that. Our DC Council, the 13 members, don't have any immigrants or children of immigrants, especially immigrants of color. And I think that it's important that we have that representation. I am running as a proud son of immigrants, as the chair of the DC Democratic Party's AAPI caucus, and there's never been an Asian American elected in DC history before either. And so I'm hoping that we can instill some diversity and have those immigrant voices heard and reflected on the DC Council. With DC Health Link, we work very closely with the undocumented community. Even though Obamacare wasn't specifically for them, we didn't turn anyone away. We held enrollment sessions where everyone could join, no matter their status. And we, through the DC Alliance program, we enrolled a lot of undocumented immigrants. And I would, through that experience, I would learn about their housing, and we would fight for them to be able to stay in their homes and fight for their rights against landlords who are pushing them out. You also asked about gig economy, and I appreciate that. And we need to support that economy as well. In my Road to Recovery plan on my website, we definitely call for more funding for and relief, expanding the DC microgrants program and making it renewable for undocumented workers. The money was coming through Events DC, which is not an organization that knows that much about undocumented workers, and we're happy to have that funding, but to have it run through Events DC seems wrong. It should be run through a committee of people who already work with that community closely, and I would push for that as well.
Great, thank you. It says your network bandwidth is low.
What? Oh, okay.
But I still can hear you. I can still hear you and see you fine. Okay. So yeah, we have one more question.
Good. I did forget to say one thing about the gig workers. I'll just say that
Sure.
I do believe these essential workers should get hazard pay for the risk that they're putting themselves through to make our economy continue working for the rest of us. So hazard pay, and then also I was even before the council voted on it, I was already supportive in my Road to Recovery of limiting the fees on restaurants and putting in guarantees that drivers and delivery workers would be held harmless. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the last question. The coronavirus pandemic has brought to the forefront issues of systemic inequalities in DC. We know that 79% of COVID-19 related deaths as of April 14th in DC were Black residents, who only make up about 46% of the population. What do you see as some of the underlying factors contributing to these disparities, and what would you do to tackle them?
I'm so glad you asked that question, Sabiha. I've been working on healthcare disparities for many years. I worked for a nonprofit in DC called the Institute for the Advancement of Multicultural and Minority Medicine. And that's a mouthful, but what they worked on was health disparities. And I've been working on it. I've been talking about it for years. And with DC Health Link, we aim to help cover people so that they could get healthcare access. But that doesn't help if you don't have the providers available. In the poorest parts of our city, they do not have adequate access to doctors and hospitals. We helped get them insurance access, insurance coverage, but you need to have health providers nearby in inadequate supply. And the hospital situation east of the river is deplorable, but I am hopeful that we are moving forward. I'm mindful that we need to worry about the corporate interests involved and make sure that the people's interests are kept paramount. And I have the public health background to prioritize this. I want to join the health committee on the council and first work to make sure we emerge from this crisis safely, but also improve our health system. I've been working with our health system for years, with our hospitals, our nurses, our clinics, Whitman Walker Clinic, La Clínica del Pueblo, Mary Center. I have those relationships already. And what we did was we gave them grants to help reach these communities, but we need to do more to help serve these communities with healthcare access. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see these health disparities persist, and we need to invest in these communities. And I have the community experience to guide me in doing so. And I'll find, if you elect me to the council, I'll finally be in a position to do something about it.
Hi, everyone. This is Yilin Zhang. I'm a Democratic candidate for DC Council Ward 2. I first came to DC about 10 years ago. I'm a transplant from Michigan and a first-generation Asian American. I've spent the last 10 years working in the healthcare industry. I've spent my entire career in DC, and DC is my home and where I want to have my family and grow old. So I look forward to speaking with all of you.
About 90,000 families live in apartments that are under DC's rent control program, which is currently up for reauthorization. The DC Council's temporary universal ban on all rent increases exposes the need for increased rent protections. What changes, if any, would you make to DC's rent control laws?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. So I have taken a look at the Reclaim Rent Control platform, and I am in agreement that we need to use this time to strengthen our current rent control laws and policies and make sure that we protect as many residents and tenants as possible to make sure that DC is an affordable place for them and their families. And with COVID-19, it has especially highlighted the need to have a resilient infrastructure and to make sure that we have policies that are proactive and protect all of our residents. So I would say that, over the next few years, the mayor has committed to 36,000 units by 2023, 12,000 of which will be affordable. I think what we need to do is make sure that the units that we build will be truly and deeply affordable, meaning that we have units that are 80% below 80% of the area median income, especially between 30 and 50%, because we have a lot of individuals and families who are getting priced out and can no longer afford to live in DC. So that is one thing. And then we also need to tackle rent control with holistic policies to make sure that we have the economic development to provide long-term employment opportunities for individuals that have true upward mobility. We also need to make sure that, we take care of all of our residents, including our homeless residents that do not have a roof over their heads right now. And we also need to make sure that across all our areas, this is not a ward-specific issue. This is a DC-wide and frankly a national issue where people need to have access to healthcare resources, access to quality education, access to affordable grocery stores. And that needs to be close by in addition to protecting our buildings to make sure that they are affordable to our residents. So for me, this is a holistic approach, and we cannot look at housing as just one thing. It is part of an entire ecosystem.
Great. The second question is, the City Council has enacted legislation that prohibits rent increases during the state of emergency and prohibits evictions until 30 days after the public health crisis has been ended. We know that nationally, 1/3 of tenants could not pay their rent on April 1st, given that over 87,000 DC workers have filed for unemployment in the last month. That statistic may be higher in the district.
Yeah.
While the courts in DC are closed to the public, landlords continue to file eviction cases online so that they can push evictions through as soon as possible. As the crisis continues, tenants will continue to fall behind on their rent and accrue a debt. What would you do to address this issue if you were on the council now?
Thank you for that question too. So this is just a nationwide issue where we have, shortage of housing, affordable housing, and also more and more residents who are unable to pay their rent and mortgages. So I don't think it's enough to have just a ban on evictions within 30 days of the end of the public health crisis. I think what we need to do now is to make sure that we place a temporary freeze on rent and mortgage payments, because it's becoming, the situation is more dire than I think many of us can imagine. When my mother and I first came here, when I was 3 years old, to rejoin with my father, we actually had to live separately. We had to rent a room in another family's home because my dad's place was too small. And then the next two places that we rented it, but we had to always rent out our second. The next place we had were 2 bedrooms. We had to rent out our second bedroom. And then the next place we lived in was our 3rd bedroom. So we had to rent out our 3rd bedroom. So I think there are a lot of families who are in a situation where maybe they're not talking about their economic situation, but they really need help, and we need to be proactive about it. Right now, the last I read, 14 states had said that landlords cannot begin the eviction process. And I think DC should be a part of that. This economic situation will continue well past the end of the stay-at-home order. It will continue probably through next year. Maybe it'll take 2 years for us to really more fully recover. So we need to plan for the long term. And so we need to make sure that tenants are not evicted well past the 30 days of the end of the public health crisis. And I'd like to really hear people's opinions about how long that should be, but I think we should be prepared for that. And we all should be working with our tenants to make sure that they know their rights, and that landlords are working with them to develop a manageable payment system that is not that they have to pay, within 30 days, or else they'll be kicked out. That's not okay, especially in this pandemic that is completely unprecedented.
Great, thanks. Third question, public housing. The DC Housing Authority states that 6,600 plus units of public housing need up to $2.5 billion in deferred maintenance and capital improvements. And the agency has charted a 20-year redevelopment plan. What would you like to see happen in public housing, and what would you do?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 big parts to this. One of the things is, with public housing, we need to make sure that we earmark the appropriate resources and have the appropriate enforcement of the use of those resources to make sure that our public housing units are maintained, and that they are livable, and that they're places that people want to be and stay and have their families. The other part of this is that we need to continue at the same time to build more units that are truly affordable. So with the 36,000 that I had mentioned before, the mayor has pledged to, and 12,000 affordable, I think we could also go a step further in saying that the new buildings that we continue to build, a certain percentage of them must be at the 30 to 50% area median income, below the 80% area median income, because the area median income is a statistic that is published through Housing and Urban Development, and we need to make sure that that number is truly reflective of the economic situation in our area. And so it's a dual effort of making sure that we maintain what we currently have. That's as important as building new units to meet the shortage and the demand. And also to make sure that when we implement a policy, that we have the right enforcement, because a policy is as good as it's enforced. And if it's not enforced, then it's almost like it's not there. So we need to make sure that we follow through and meet all of our residents' needs.
This one is about the homelessness. From encampment clearings to the threat of COVID outbreaks in shelters, we know that DC's homeless services programs are not working for many residents. How would you ensure that all DC residents have safe, quality, and affordable housing?
Mm-hmm. That's a very important question. We need to find real solutions that are sustainable for our homeless residents. And unfortunately, I've talked to some of the residents through some of my volunteer work, and just meeting people that are frankly encamped on the streets right now. And there are many more of them. And it's not safe for our homeless residents to be out there, especially in light of COVID-19. But they also don't want to go to the shelters. And that's for a number of reasons. It includes not feeling safe. going to the shelters. It includes not feeling like they're not clean. There are bed bugs at the shelters. Not feeling or not being able to go with their partner if they do not have children, and not being able to bring their pets and service animals without going through a process. So there's a lot of different barriers and situations that prevents an individual from wanting to go to a shelter. And so I believe that we need to have a housing first policy. In places like Helsinki, where they have a housing first policy, they've almost been able to eradicate homelessness. And that's something that takes political will, and that's something that I believe we can do. In January 2019, when DC did a point in time count, there were more than 6,500 homeless individuals. And that number could be more. It could be much higher at this point. So we need to do everything we can where we have a housing first policy. And what I mean by that is making sure that our homeless residents get stable housing, and then to coordinate that with streamlined wraparound services. That includes mental and behavioral health care. That includes access to substance abuse resources to make sure that individuals get the assistance they need. That includes access to physical health care. That includes access to employment opportunities that will pay above the minimum wage and offer long-term opportunities. And then that also includes for our single parents, making sure that they have access to affordable care, childcare, because they cannot go out and work if they can't find someone to help them with taking care of their children. So there's a lot of things that we need to do, but I believe we can do it.
Great. And the next question is our 1 minute question. We've talked about DC's affordable housing crisis with respect to rent control, public housing, and homelessness. What would your top 3 priorities related to housing as council members be? Just list them, don't go into
Okay. So that includes what I had, just the continuation of what I said earlier, making sure that our homeless residents have stable housing, access to a housing first policy so that they can have a roof over their heads that is stable, making sure that we increase the supply of truly and deeply affordable units. So as we continue to develop and build as a city, that individuals and families have access to units that are affordable at the studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, etc., starter homes that are truly affordable. And then lastly, making sure, we had touched on this earlier, that we maintain our public housing units, maintain them appropriately so that people can live in them and thrive in the community.
The impacts of the coronavirus, this is back to 3 minutes. The impacts of the coronavirus have also revealed the lack of a real safety net for workers in DC, particularly undocumented workers and those working in the informal and gig economy. How would you address these issues?
You know, it's what my background, as I mentioned earlier, has been last 10 years in healthcare. And one of the things that came out during COVID-19 is the virtual tip jar, where residents can go and send, individuals in the service industry tips. And I took a look at that list, and the last I looked at it, there were probably more than 4,000 individuals on that list. But of the individuals who answered, more than 50% do not have healthcare benefits. And that's a real issue. So we need to make sure that, I frankly don't like these labels: documented, undocumented, informal, formal. Everyone is an individual and they deserve access to unemployment resources. They deserve access to federal support. And that's where nationally, we've fallen short. No matter what your status is, you should be able to have access to those things because you are a resident here as much as anyone else. And I think what we need to do is also make sure that with our unemployment, we need to have a streamlined effort where the system is efficient. And, like AOC has said, we need to legislate like rent is due today, because we need to make sure that people get the resources they need. And I think, we need to work with our people as if we were in their shoes. And I think that our economy is going to be changing. You know, not everyone is able to work from home. They may not have a full-time job. So we need to make sure that we put forth policies where every individual has access to paid sick leave. They have access to unemployment resources. They have access to the things that, frankly, you know, ultimately also serves our economy and makes us a stronger community. So we need to fight for everyone as if they are a part of our community, whether or not, you know, they're this or that.
Great. Now we're down to the end here. This is the last question. The coronavirus pandemic has brought to the forefront issues of systemic inequalities in DC. We know that 79% of the COVID-related deaths as of May 2nd in DC were Black residents, who only make up about 46% of the population. What do you see as some of the underlying factors contributing to these disparities, and what would you do to tackle them?
So I look at it as it mentioned way in the beginning that we need to build a resilient infrastructure that has proactive policies that protect all of our residents. So in this situation, COVID-19 has highlighted the need to make sure that all of our communities, all of our wards have equal access to healthcare resources. In DC, we have the highest rate of maternal mortality in the United States. And wards 7 and 8 have some of the highest incidences of chronic conditions, including diabetes. And so I do understand that now, you know, United Medical Center is set to close, and DC has entered into pledging 2 new hospitals, St. Elizabeth's and Howard University Hospital. And that will be opening over the next several years. But we also need to make sure that when we build these institutions, these organizations, that we continue to provide healthcare information, enhance our community's healthcare literacy, and build trust in communities so that when we finish building, that people will know that they can go there and access great quality healthcare, and that you know, they will get taken care of efficiently and effectively. So, you know, that's one of the things. And also, COVID-19 has highlighted the fact that we have a lot of frontline workers that do not have the luxury of working from home, working virtually. So we need to have protections for our workers so that they have access to paid sick leave, that they have access to the resources they need to best take care of themselves, and to also pay to make sure that they can continue to live in the community. And, you know, the other things that I had mentioned is access to affordable childcare. We have a lot of single parents, single mothers who they have hours that are not convenient for them to be able to, you know, take care of their kids and also work. So we need to make sure that when we think about creating policies, that we think about all the communities that will be impacted and make sure that our policy can speak to them and be responsive to them. And so that is something that, you know, my wish for a council member and what I commit to do is to collaborate across the board and make sure that our policies are comprehensive and holistic, and really give a voice to all of our residents and make sure that they have a seat at the table to creating a policy that can be responsive to their needs.